Scott County, providing safe, healthy, and livable communities.
Good morning.
Good morning.
This morning we are going to talk about both decision-making around taxes and priorities, as well as communicating with our citizens about those priorities. This is one of the strategies from our existing strategic plan that, as you know, will sunset at the end of the year. And we have not presented information on this particular strategy, at least in this way, at Scott County Delivers before. So it's kind of our kind of both a start and a wrap up to that part of our strategic plan. So we're also going to have a little bit of conversation about going forward and some of the priority-based budgeting thinking and kind of what we know today about where we might go with that piece and some next steps around communication with citizens. So with that, I think I'd ask the panel to introduce themselves. Then we'll ask presenters to just do a quick introduction. Danny Lenz is going to provide a brief overview.
Pam Selvig, Health and Human Services Director.
Scott House, Emergency Management and Communications Director.
Jen Schwartz, Health and Human Services.
Jake Grusing, Library Director.
Leslie Vermillion, the County Administrator.
Steve Jones, Principal Financial Analyst.
Danny Lenz, Chief Financial Officer. So as Chris was saying, this is really our first time going through this one. And I think there's a lot of things that we've really done well to try and communicate and use reliable information to communicate service priorities, budget decisions, and value for taxes paid. But I think we have a long way to go as well in trying to do a better job of that. We probably have some of the better community indicators tied directly to this strategy, since we ask a question on the citizen survey about what residents see for the values their taxes are paid at. But in communicating the decision-making process, communicating those service priorities, I think is an area that we really need to focus on moving forward, and one that we have some pretty good plans going forward of how we're going to do that. Some of those key areas are communicating more information in a more transparent way, so both the residents, members of the organization, and especially the board has a clear understanding of how we're making these decisions, what is included in those budgetary decisions. We have some really good and consistent high-level indicators when we talk about our inflation plus growth kind of barometer for where we come out on the tax levy. But we get further into the details of it, and it becomes a little bit less consistent and reliable, which is really an area we're trying to focus on, particularly with priority-based budgeting and the presentations we do to the board. We've done a lot of work in the priority-based budgeting area, but one of the things that's our next step forward is how do we incorporate that work into the decision-making process and have that be reflected where we can say, this was funded partially because it was such a high priority to the organization and to the community, and having that be part of the discussion as we're making those budgetary decisions.
Thanks, Danny. All right. Who'd like to start us off here?
I can start. On page 5, the citizens' rating of value for taxes paid. This is an area we've struggled. We are making good strides. It looks like we've increased quite a bit. I'm curious, how can we impact this, or what thoughts do we have as a group on impacting this particular measure?
So I think there's two parts. When we talk about where we put our tax dollars, I think if we look to different graphs, we can show that we put it into what we see as services that provide direct value based on our results map. I'm not sure how much time we spend communicating that out to the residents and saying, this is where we put our dollars. This is the value that you should be getting back for the money that we've spent. I do think there are some other struggles with that too. Value for taxes paid question, people can read into it what they want to. So someone who has is directly impacted by, say, an HHS service is going to see a lot of value for their taxes paid from the county. Or someone who's been in an emergency situation is going to see a lot of value. But if you haven't been in those situations and your only engagement with the county is going to get your driver's license or your tabs or paying taxes, you're not seeing those other things necessarily every single year as you're getting asked this question.
I think one of the other things, Jen, in there, though, it's to Danny's point, is the communication of some of the priorities. So when you look at things like move about the county safely, or that we provide adequate trails so people can move as part of the results maps, or some of the things we do in public health with clean air, water, and land, and environmental health, how we tie those back to some of those reports, to the scene, to our social media. I think talking about those things and explaining the impacts it has to people, and I think we've you can see some improvement, right? DWM started in 2010. 7% change is considered statistically significant, if I remember what Lisa told us. So I think we're making progress, but I still think some of the storytelling, we could do a better job of in our story, along with some of the data and what it means to folks. And I think that's what those efforts for the residents report, tying it back to the scene, some of the things we do also help tell that story.
Question on page 6, and maybe, I don't know if Danny or Steve, as I understand that chart, our quartile 4 spending has actually decreased the percentage of the budget since 2016, and that would be a good thing, I assume, because those are the pieces that are kind of less critical, not mandated kind of things. So I'm curious, since we, as you've talked about, we really haven't used PBB yet for budget decisions. Why do you think that's dropped? I guess, so if you have any thoughts on why that has dropped. And I'm kind of curious if things like no longer doing new options and that kind of thing might also play into that.
So I think it's dropped because it still is in the back of our minds how this ties to the priorities that we have for the board, and those should be directly related. And as we use that in the budget decision-making process, whether it's through the administrator or the work Steve and I have done, those are conversations that happen, but we're not very transparent with it of how is this request coming forward, how does it tie to a prioritization, how is this prioritization being used. It's a little bit more nebulous and subjective instead of an objective measure saying, this went up in our rating because it was tied to this result map and because it was a quartile 1 or quartile 2 program. One thing just to note on the PBB scoring sheets as well is that part of priority-based budgeting is you revisit these every couple of years. And so that's where you see the significant change from one year to the next where we've gone through a reprioritization. And so that's where there might be a big jump between like 2016 and 2017 was a little bit more consistent, and the 2018 to 2019.
Okay.
There wasn't that significant shift of resources. And so this is one that we pulled the information we had right now, but there might be a little bit different way of looking at it in terms of looking at the budget requests, what quartiles were they in, what was funded, so we can look year to year of how is this allocated through there.
The other thing, Pam, is a lot of quartile 4 is mandated. They're mandated programs. Their elections, their taxation, their land records, they're things we have to do by statute, but they're not areas we've invested big increases in. So as the rest of the areas have grown and seen some investment in growth, they have not. So they've shrunk as a portion of that also. But a lot of quartile 4 isn't that they're not mandated. They are mandated things. But if you go to our results maps, nobody says the assessor is our highest priority if we were to ask the public, right? They're looking at the services that they see. These things in quartile 4 are things we have to do, like the election, again, land records, the county surveyor, and taxation. Those types of things that wouldn't necessarily pop to the top of the public when they're looking at priorities in their service. But that's where the efficiencies and trying to be more efficient in those areas and effective come into play.
Jake, you're on the budget team, and I'm wondering how, like, if you can talk a little bit about how adding the budget team has changed the conversation and how you consider some of this priority-based budgeting scoring in that process.
Yeah, so Danny and Leslie, I think, adding a layer and some added time into the budgeting process. We have to start a lot earlier in the year to get to the end result of presenting the budget to the county board for adoption. I think has been a huge step forward in sort of weaving into the organization a better understanding of how budgets actually get created and what decisions get made, and they're difficult decisions. I think this year, I think Danny just said yesterday, we need about a 5% levy increase to satisfy all of the requests that came forward. And being on the budget team, to see every one of those requests and to learn about them with the program managers that forwarded them, really helps my understanding when I go back to my department if the library requests aren't granted, to say we didn't get what we requested, but Scott in the sheriff's office got what he requested, and that was a very important, that was a critical request for the people in our community. It helps us internally, I think, understand the priorities and how they impact our residents. So the internal communication is one piece of that, and I think what Danny's already touched on, we'll probably talk about a little bit more, is then how do we communicate that to the public as well, that this is where we're making new investments or enhanced investments. But I think it's a huge step forward in understanding and transparency.
Nice,
And
thanks.
I think one of the reasons we wanted to do a budget team, and we reference it in the materials, is also that our employees can be our best communicators and ambassadors out in the community. It's small one-on-one conversations, but we've already seen our employees take the initiative to explain something and how something works, as opposed to just saying this is what the law is. And having that go a step further and explain why we did this or why we did that, clarifying how the building was funded, which we did actually hear just last week in a meeting. More information to our employees, all it does is benefit us in communicating how these decisions were made. It's a small level, it's a not very visible one from the big picture, but it has a lot of impact where an employee can explain to their family members, their neighbors, someone who's coming up to a customer service counter about how something happened.
So that added transparency, you have more people in the organization, you have more of the opportunity for that organic kind of conversation.
Yeah.
And they're our best ambassadors, right, to the public in talking about what the county does and why it makes investments is our employees.
Yep, okay, thank you.
Page 7. Oh, no, you go ahead. I've
All right,
already
I was
read
also
it.
going to page 7, so
Okay, we may have the same
we will
question.
tag team this question here. So we're talking about the county levy as a percentage of total personal income. First of all, can you start off by talking about how does Scott County compare to neighboring counties within the metro as far as personal income as a base? And then how this indicator will change with continued growth in the county, and what happens if population changes and we, for example, have more people of lower income that come into the county. So how does this matter and how does this connect to what's important?
Can I just add my questions too, so you might have trouble keeping
Start
track
making
of
a
all?
list.
Because I had similar kind of lines of questions, because it's really good to see it dropping. It's very good. But then when I go to page 8, then I say, well, okay, well, we don't look as good as some of our other neighboring counties on that percent. So kind of what are the other variables that kind of contribute to that or make a difference?
All right, so we are the highest income county in the state. We usually switch back and forth between Carver and ourselves. So that is going to play an impact on what that percentage of income is there for us. I will say it is a good trend to have that as income is growing, our levy is going down, our percentage of the income that we're taking in. I think that it is something that we want to keep an eye on. Now, one thing when you look at different counties, each county does something different, does things different, approaches services differently. A lot of our efforts in scale, I think, could impact where our levy is when we look at just Scott County's levy as a percentage of income. There are things that we do that we don't charge back cities for, that other counties do charge back cities for, that aren't centralized, and that is a shared thing. So the county levy may be down in one area, but the city's levies are higher, and we're just comparing county to county. So where I would consider this is it's a good trend to keep note of in a comparison, but without digging into all of the different differences of services and how we provide services and the things we do, it's hard to make a direct comparison of that. The other thing I would note is that, and it's not going to be global again, is that as you get larger, you gain some more natural efficiencies. One of the things we talk about here is we have a lot of single incumbent positions because we've had something that has started to come up where we have to create a position for one person to do this sort of thing. As communities grow, counties grow, and their staffing, there may be more people able to do that, and you may get some efficiencies versus what your population is and the tax levy in order to do that, and it makes it a smaller percentage of that tax levy. So I'd say that's a factor impacting it. What questions did I miss?
Pat, I can talk about the personal income directly with our neighboring counties. In comparison, us in Carver County, Scott County and Carver County are pretty similar in the total personal income. Anoka County and Washington County are about double our size, personal income. Ramsey County is 3.5 times. Dakota County is 3 times our personal income. And Hennepin County is 11 times our size in total personal income across the whole spectrum.
So I'd like to take it to the next step of, as things change, as we grow, how do we monitor, or how does this KPI give us a gauge for what kind of change we're seeing, and then how do we react to that?
So I don't think that this gives us a gauge for what type of change we're seeing. I think it gives us a barometer of, are we keeping our growth in the percentage of income we take from people slower than what their income is going up? What we don't want to be at is people's incomes are going up and we are reaping all of that cost into providing just more services and increasing their taxes. We want people's income to grow, and our costs are going to have to grow as part of that, but we want our portion of their income to become less and less. That's where we gather some of those efficiencies.
Good.
On page 11, you had kind of answered my question on page 12, because when you talked about the cities and billing back to the cities, that probably has some impact on that. But on page 11, if I'm reading that right, we're paying $450 per capita in county taxes in Scott County. Is the state average $1885? Is that what I'm reading?
No, I believe that is all Scott County taxing entities.
Oh, all Scott County. Okay, thank you. And when you look at page 12, we're right in the middle of the pack there, but it's a pretty big variation, 328 in Dakota up to 657 in Hennepin. Is that where we want to be when we look at, do you feel like we want to continue to shift downward, or is this the right level when we look at it?
Again, I think this is informative of where we are and gives us some indicators. I don't think this is the be-all, end-all of where we want to be. Being the lowest doesn't necessarily mean our residents are getting the lowest taxes overall. Some of that's distributed through the cities based on how we provide services. Things like we use our sales tax to provide regional impact projects, where we could use that maybe for more of our road projects and decrease the levy, but that doesn't really help our residents and meet our goals. So I think we want to be conscious of it, but this is really a reflection of the service delivery decisions we choose to make. Hennepin County, I think this would be indicative of they choose to provide a lot more services and things that maybe we don't feel would fit within the county here. And Dakota County may choose to provide less services, or they may choose to provide services differently under a different model. So I think it's a barometer to say are our decisions pushing us in the wrong direction to where either services are getting lower than where we want them to be, or we're providing more services or services more expensively than we want to be. So it's a barometer, not a we want to be here necessarily. Now, the political perspective, maybe we want to be here because it is a better message to communicate that we provide X, Y, or Z. I think our message is a little bit more nuanced in terms of how we choose to deliver, because I think scale is one of those things that not other places have, and the shared cost that we do through that does make us have to bear more of the cost as an entity, but in reality, we believe it's less cost to the residents overall.
This is also reflected, I think, right, of the 5 border county size and getting towards some of those efficiencies. So when you take a look at the size of some of the systems and the people, they go right in order. Dakota, that's the exact size of the ring counties. And that has to do, I think, with some of the growth, the maturity, and the efficiencies that you get at a certain point. And then when you get bigger, it goes the other direction. And so, I think that's indicative of that too, just kind of showing you some of that.
We talked a couple times already about scale and how scale contributes to, or has a big impact on the county share of the tax dollars. Can you talk about some of the programs that are done differently here at the county, where we say aren't charging back to the cities, where the county's bearing that portion of cost within its levy, and how does that differ from some of our neighbors?
Look to Leslie to have a better definition of that.
Well, there's several. I think law enforcement is one of them, right? If you take a look at dispatch, quite a few of the dispatch centers in the metro area charge back, or they have a model where they contribute. We don't. We believe that everybody in the community needs 911. If they need help, we need to be there, right? Doesn't matter the color of the snowplow, doesn't matter the color of the uniform. When our folks need help, we need to be there, and we need to respond that way. And so our county board has continually had a discussion on, we will continue to provide those services more efficiently and not spend time billing back and calculating and trying to get into that, because our residents need it, and that's a higher priority. In transportation, I think we clearly have always had one of the lower cost sharing. If you look to our neighbor to the east, You know, their cities pay 45% to 50% of the cost of a highway project. Traditionally here, it's been in the 12 to 15% ratio, so there's some differences there on collecting back as folks have urbanized. We waive permits, you know, we have discussions on permits. Our highway department for government entities waives those. We wouldn't see that necessarily at every county. If the city of Shakopee, if the city of Prior Lake comes in and it's a $5,000 utility permit, we waive it because we don't see the benefit of taxing another government entity. We would do it for the DNR, we would do that for MnDOT. Not even all of our cities do those types of things when we take a look at it. So I think there's lots of things we do and we encourage, you know, having a discussion with the sheriff. They would encourage if a city needs somebody that our deputy could be the first to respond, we want him to be the first to respond. That isn't necessarily the attitude everywhere. And so it really is, if we all work together overall, it's better for our community than charging back those types of things.
And a follow-up question to that, how do we then communicate that to our stakeholders? Since we are different and, let's face it, I, like everybody else, once a year, twice a year, get the tax statement, I see where my taxes are, and I look at that big number where I'm looking at the county taxes, the school district taxes, the city taxes, and every other entity that's on there. So how do we communicate the value that we are delivering as a county where we're not spending time doing accounting and back and forth, billing and cross-billing? How do we communicate that the county share may seem like it's high to somebody, but how do we communicate how many things we're collectively doing or collaboratively doing amongst our entities, and that we may see a little more money on the county share if we're delivering those services across the board?
I think we've told it through some stories, probably through the scene or through some different articles. I don't know that we've had a vigorous campaign to actually talk about that way, because it's just our philosophy, it's our attitude, it's something the board encourages us to do, it's how we work. You know, if I think we thought we needed to, we certainly could work with Claire and Lisa and talk about that more through the residents report or the scene. But it's probably been more through small articles or discussions or, you know, working with folks that we talk about that. I don't think we've had a campaign, you know, to say those types of things.
I also think, and part of what we talked about where we want to go with this is using data and clear, reliable data to communicate those priorities in the budget decision-making is an area we need to strengthen in. I think that that inconsistency in the communication and that lack of a resident being able to dig in if they so choose hurts us because we don't have something we can easily point to. In a budget book, for example, your average resident is not going to read that ever. But if someone really wants to dig into something, we're trying to communicate something, and we have a document that we have every single year to show how this has been funded, how this has moved forward, and it has a piece of that narrative communication as to why this may be different. That gives us a resource to go to that we can have as consistent and not just something we had to go in and make up for a scene article or go pull the information on, but that can be looked back over several years.
Thank you.
All right, I'm not an accountant, so I'm going to look to Steve because I find these charts very interesting. However, I'm not sure I fully understand them, or some of them seem counterintuitive to me. So if you look at page 9, our county tax rate since 2014 has consistently been going down. Good thing. But then, when you go to page 11, our county tax levy per capita has actually been going up. And we know incomes have been going up. So why is that? So the tax rate's going down, but the tax levy for per capita is going up. What's counterintuitive to me? What does that?
The biggest difference there is the two bases to those numbers. The first one, the tax rate is based on the tax capacity of our community. And
Okay.
the graph on page 12 is based on the per capita, the population of Scott County. So the tax capacity of Scott County of all the commercial, industrial, residential properties has grown faster than what the population has grown.
Oh, okay.
And grown faster than what our levy has grown.
Okay. Good explanation.
Page 13. I found it surprising and great that despite that we're generally conservative around taxes and those numbers didn't fare as well in the survey, citizens really see a value in the services we provide from our employees and the actual services. How do you feel we've been able to make a positive impact? We've shifted that up over the last 8 years pretty substantially.
I think it's because we do focus on our highest priority services. When we're making those decisions, when we're talking about where we're going to invest our dollars, it's the ones where we believe are going to have the most impact on residents and going to improve their quality of life or improve their experience here. I also think it relates directly to slides further on, where we talk about the perception of Scott County employees, where that has gone up as well. And I think that the people delivering the service can have an impact on the people's overall impression. A lot of what we do is mandated by the state, procedures followed by the state, but how we deliver them through the people that are doing it, I think have a lot of impact on people's overall perception of whether it's a good service or not. You can get the exact same thing from one location or another across the metro area, but if you have a positive experience and someone is helpful and willing to figure out how to get to yes instead of just telling you no, I think that has an impact on people's perceptions of the services that are delivered.
I would agree, Jen. I think there's been an emphasis in some of those culture discussions on how to get to yes, especially in a lot of areas, and not just shifting and no. I think that's one of the big ones. The other one is, I mean, there's specific programs like in the library on this discussion on fees, and staff have the ability to waive them if they see an issue or something odd that's happened. Giving staff the ability to make some of these decisions and just move forward, empowering them, I think, to do the right things within their decision-making, I think is a huge part of getting us to better service. I watched what Julie Hansen did with a driver's license with a gentleman that called me about a month ago, and how she resolved that so far above and beyond in getting him his license, an elderly gentleman, on something that got hung up at the state. And those types of things, I think, are huge, and as people talk about those, they realize the service and the customer service they get, but they know they're empowered to go ahead and do those things and resolve issues, and I think that's a really important part of it.
Yeah, you see it I mean, if you look at Spirit of Scott, the nominations, we talk about them here once a quarter with 3 or 4 of the big ones, but it's happening every day in our organization. People are going above and beyond for the residents here, and that's just the stuff that we're noticing and sharing with the rest of the org.
Sometimes just the small things.
Yeah.
Staying on page 14 with the citizen impression of the Scott County employees. From each of your positions, I'm going to ask a little outside of data here, but what do you think is driving this change most? What's driving, we talked about enabling employees, or employees feeling like they're enabled to find solutions or find a way to yes. What drives that as an organization? How is the tone different here than it may be in another area or than it was during a different time to drive that?
I think it starts with our new employee orientation, where we talk about that as part of our philosophy. We try and talk and kind of indoctrinate them into our culture right from the beginning. I think as we move forward, we have to continue to reinforce that to get better, but I think that's the starting point. Not every organization has a new employee orientation that focuses so much on the culture of who we want to be and what we're doing, and an opportunity to sit down with the leadership of the org and really hear that they support and reinforce this, and that they should be taking that approach with things. So I think that's where it starts, and then because that is the culture of the org, it gets reinforced mostly, and hopefully we can continue to improve on it through supervisors and coworkers about how do we get to yes, how do we support the residents. I know anecdotally in the last month or so, we've been hearing about employees stopping and seeing someone who's kind of looks confused, trying to find which building to go into, and always being willing to stop and help them and point them in the right direction. And I've seen it dozens of times since it started, and it's not the 16 employees go by the person before the one nice one does. It's the person turns left, turns right, and then has a vague look, and the first employee you see stops and goes, "Where can I help you get to?" And that's a small thing, but those things matter to people.
Thank you.
Do you see supports in our culture for the, like you talked about getting to yes, and that's a cultural piece that is a strong part of our customer service. Are there things in our culture that support individual employees thinking about, like, this isn't our money, this is taxpayer money, we need to be responsible for it, we need to use it smartly. Like, we have those conversations at a leadership level often. Are there supports within our culture to sort of breed that in our employees? Or how do we, that sort of stewardship kind of value?
So I don't know if there are structural supports in our culture, but I do think we talk a lot about it isn't our money, it's the taxpayer dollars, and that we try and be very responsible and take a fiscal approach, or a fiscally conservative approach to things. I think that conversation as part of the culture helps with that. I think we see it at the end of the year as we've put more and more money into fund balance, which has actually prevented us from having to levy more taxes in order to maintain a healthy fund balance. That is departments having a budget that they could spend more out of and choosing not to because they know that that money goes to prevent the tax levy from having to increase to help our fund balance at the end. But they're ending up to the good, and there's nothing that restricts them from spending more money if they really felt the need to, except for good leadership.
And I would hope, Chris, that some of the things we're doing with the data that hopefully are driving into staff meetings and the use of data and discussions, the capital improvement committee, when they take and go through and people know it gets scored and looked at, that when we talk about innovation and trying to drive change, but we need to do it very consciously. When we talk about this at orientation, that it has to be conscious decision, working with people up and downstream, but how do we become more efficient? How do we become innovative in how we provide services? And that's what we're paying folks, to think, not just to shuffle and sign papers, right? And so I think there are some cultural things we're trying to do in orientation to talk about that, on being very conscious of that, of being conscious of the innovation, of understanding how we do certain things, and we want them to provide suggestions, but working up and downstream with folks, not just changing something like that. So those types of discussions, I would hope also bring back at staff meetings and as we talk with folks, the importance of being fiscally conservative in our investments, but making the right decision, that we keep people safe first, right? I mean, that we're having a discussion right now at McMahon Lake, and Paul, if it's that bad and we get another 1.5 inches of rain last night, we got to figure out a way to start to lower that even before we have the perfect thing, because it might be a safe and health issue. And so how do we do that? It's the right decision to do. And so within that box, knowing that staff have the ability again to do that and try to come to the right decision, I would hope is part of what that is.
Part of that, okay, thanks.
Can I add that I think it starts with, well, probably begins and ends with our residents, but to some extent starts with our board, and I think we have a long history here. Part of it, our success now, is that for the last 20 years as an organization, we've been trying to embed this in our culture, starting with the board, wanting to invest in staff, making how we treat people while we're providing services a priority. Then sort of one conversation at a time with leadership, with managers, with supervisors, and with frontline staff. Over a course of 2 decades, I think you get to a point where that is how Scott County operates. And we can talk about that proudly and honestly when we do onboard new staff, that it isn't just, this is the sheet of paper that has our values. This is something that we live out in our organization. Our residents experience that.
Small things like the buildings are actually owned by the public. How do we allow them to use it, right? The open library concept. It's not easy. It's not to replace staff. We still need librarians. We still need good staff. And the trust is not everybody can be on the schedule we can provide staff. So how, though, do we allow people to use, they own that building in a professional way that allows them access they need to do things? And I think having that trust, having that confidence that they understand that is what helps move some of those things forward.
Okay. It's unfortunate Lisa Koner wasn't able to be here today to talk a little bit about some of the social media pieces and some of the communication, but I'm wondering what you see as people in leadership, particularly around budgets and decisions. Where are opportunities for use of social media in a different way? That came up a few times at the strat planning meetings, and just wondering if you see places where we could expand our public communication.
I think there always are. I think it's that clarity in what's going into the budget. We've always kind of maintained it at a pretty high level when we're communicating out about and focusing on that levy, where we kept it, what are the parameters we have for not allowing it to go over a certain amount. But we haven't talked about how we are providing efficiencies with an investment in a new technology or providing better services by adding a position in order for safety. We don't talk about the specifics of it, and it opens us up to additional scrutiny and criticism. Why are you spending on that? But it also gives us an opportunity to explain those things. I think when they can see where the dollars are going, residents have a little bit more understanding, even if they don't always agree, that at least there was a conscious effort to inform them of how that money was being spent, why we needed that increased tax dollars, the dollars they work hard for, and where we really see it's going to provide value to them. So I think it's that clear explanation of this is specifically what we did, not just we spent it on this area and this area and this area, but this is exactly what you're getting for that service.
I think 15 is really important. It's the one I talk about in the residents report. It's the one I watch every survey. You know, I'd like to drive that one to 100%, you know, but it's going to take us a while to get there, but I think it's really important. I think I've heard the board talk about that, to make sure that we're transparent. When you go to the results maps on responsible, and they're in the survey, and clearly the people took time to look at them, because that one, all of those results maps are like between 94 to 98% important. You go to some others, they're all the way down into the 60 percentiles. So clearly the transparency, the listening, providing certain services, this one is there. And if we're doing a good job of informing them, whether it's through social media, the website, cable TV, board meetings, going to meetings, whatever it is, and they feel informed, I think will improve then in their understanding some of those services. So I'm with Danny on that one.
It was interesting to read in the narrative at the front that we have such a high rating for the services provided, right? And taxes were also rated as, I think it was first in the citizen survey, the number one.
Concern.
Is that right? The number one concern was taxes. And there was this really strong recognition of the quality of services. And so just sort of balancing just that people prefer not to pay taxes probably, but kind of looking at that balance about, and they like what they're getting and they don't want to pay taxes. And so how do you move through that as finance people? I am not a finance person. Tell me how you move through that.
I don't know about that, but you know, if Lisa was here, she would also tell you that there's lots of counties that don't, where the residents say they don't like to pay taxes. This county is highly tax averse nationwide when we compare ourselves. Far more tax averse. And so it is interesting when you take a look at that on a national normalized standard. It's where we're at.
And then that's a big challenge, right? Then how do we expand transparency? How are we good communicators if our audience is kind of tax sensitive, I think is the term that was used in the materials, so.
Well, when I first read it, I think of, well, this is a pretty good problem to have if our biggest problem that the residents see is that taxes are too high, when we can say that we're actually pretty good on taxes and we're constantly driving the percentage of the income down. But I also think it makes challenges because we see the side as county employees that not every resident sees all the time, and knows that there's true need out there for certain individuals, and know that we may not always be meeting at the level that that individual needs in order to get themselves back on their feet. And so that's where, as we make these decisions that do go up and drive taxes in a tax-averse community, we have to have that more communication, more transparency in it, and be able to both use data and tell the story, because it's both sides of it, to say this is why this is important. And yes, again, that person still may not have wanted to do that, but they can say, hey, at least it's going to something important.
I think it may be one reason why a lot of the people who work here. To me, and I'll just speak for myself. I think the reality in which we operate is very clear. Our residents help make that clear for us. That in some counties, maybe even the county I live in, the solution is just more money. We'll bring more money in, and then we'll provide the services we want, however we want to provide them. In Scott County, I think it forces us to work even harder at work that's really worth doing and forces us to be a little bit more creative. And I think that's, for me, that's really stimulating and energizing to work in an environment where we hold those two kind of, they seem like paradoxes. We want taxes to be low, and we think you're doing an awesome job. So how do we keep both of those things in mind? How do we keep the taxes low? And how do we continue to provide services as needs evolve and change? As somebody who wants to serve the public, I think it's a fascinating problem, and it's one of the reasons I'm here. And I think it's one of the things that invigorates our culture is that forces us to be creative.
You know, I was working with a group last week that they were doing some goal setting for their department, and a staff person said that she got fired up about being creative, because if you have an understanding that we want to be conservative about funding and that throwing more money at a problem isn't necessarily the answer, that forces you then, or gives you the opportunity, I guess, depending on how you want to frame it, to get more creative about solutions. And that was really, it's nice to hear that from you, but it was really nice to hear that coming from a staff person as well, that they saw that opportunity. So thanks for speaking to that. Okay. What about going forward? We've been part of some conversations about how do we do this better, and what are our assets as far as community engagement and community communication.
I think one of the big goals, at least for Steve and I, is to really develop the priority-based budgeting. How are we going to use that in the decision-making process? We've started, I think, a pretty concerted effort this year, and I'm sure it's going to evolve in the next couple of years as we say this didn't really work as well as we had hoped, but really trying to drive that conversation and be able to show that value. I think the other piece of it is really determining what is the clear, reliable information and story we want to tell from a budgetary financial perspective, so that we can constantly say, this is where we were, this is what changed, this is where we are now, and this is where we are going forward. That is very reliable and useful. Again, I've worked in budgets and finance for a lot of years now, and very few times have I ever had a resident call up and say, where is this? But on the flip side, I've had elected officials go, where's my copy of the budget book, or where's my copy of what changed? Because when residents ask me something, I go and I can flip right to the page, or I can pull this thing and say, this is exactly how we spent that money. So I think that's one of the things we need to do going forward, is determining what is our useful, reliable information that we want to be able to consistently and clearly communicate to the public, even if it's sitting on a shelf most of the time. If you have that chance to impact it in one news story or with just a few residents, it can still provide value and help shift, and provide transparency to the organization and to the board to be able to explain what's going on. So I think that's moving going forward with how do we communicate those service priorities through PBB and communicate those budget decisions even more.
Can I do kind of a follow-up to that, Danny? Because one of the things that kind of struck me, and maybe it's kind of connected to what you're saying here, but one of the things you identified on page 2 that what isn't working, it says budget decision and decision-making process has been high level with limited detail readily available. So I don't know, from where I sit, there's a lot of detail. And I mean, at this point, any budget increase, we have to do a budget request form. Mm-hmm. So, what are you looking for in that?
I think I'm looking for the process to be clear, the process to be more consistent. And I know we've changed it the last 2 years and it's not very consistent, but what's the information we're trying to get out of it? I think we stepped back and tried to really focus in this year on what are those decision points, as opposed to every department having to submit a budget request for every single change in their budget. It was more, where are we getting at new? But it's the detail that we're bringing to what has been funded or not funded that was requested. We don't have that transparency in the process when it's been presented, at least more in the more recent history. It's been, we had $700,000 for technology software improvements. That doesn't talk about where that technology software improvement went, what it went to improve, how it's going to improve the services for residents, and tied to the performance measures that we talk about so much. So we're not tying it to the objectives we're trying to achieve. The other piece is I don't think the organization understands how those decisions are made and what necessarily goes into it. They may say, I got funding or I didn't get funding this year for my request, but they don't necessarily see that we funded in this area and this is why we funded in that area and here's the justification. So that's where I'm talking about that detail and trying to make sure it's more clear to the organization, because yes, the departments provide us a ton of detail. It's that communication back on how we got to that final end product that I think we have some work to do on.
And involving the board in that and the budget team, I think we bring all the requests forward to the board as we've talked through it, and they'd like to see some of those requests. And I'm glad Jake talked about it earlier on the budget team, because that really was one of our goals, is that if directors in a department or a manager within a Barb Dahl or a Craig Jensen or a Mike Thompson, whoever it is, understand and see, that also helps that discussion on the priorities. There's probably every department who would like new staff in this county, right? And the board has this much to do it in. So what are those objectives? What are the things? And what are the measures we're not meeting the mark that we need to be able to justify that funding? And so I think to be able to talk to that better, I think is one of the things that we're talking about there. The other thing that is the tie to the data and the community indicators. I think that's really important. I think we've started. We've done a pretty good job of tying our KPIs, the community indicators, but how those investments are supporting those and the ones that the board thinks are a priority, I think are big deals. And then the other thing is some of those innovative things that we talked about and the changes and the challenges. I mean, I think if you think about scale, if you think about fish, if you think about some of those big things that we've done in this county, maybe that are a little different than other communities, I think that came from that innovation and that need to work together. It doesn't just have to be the government doing it all the time, right? But how do we work together to do some of those types of things? And so those types of thoughts and how those play into how we deliver services and different models, as we look at some of these reentry and the housing issues we're facing, no matter what it is, as we start to grow towards 200,000 people, this community is changing over the next 20 years. We need to have some of those types of community supports that isn't just government within our county. And so how do we plan, how do we look at those business models to get us there? I think those are some big things that we have to think about.
As a follow-up to that, I was in a meeting recently, we were talking about the role of advisory councils, and lots of people in this room commit time and purpose to those groups. Do they factor in here in a different way, either in terms of informing the budget or communicating some of the priorities or some of the decision-making? Is there a way to use those better?
Yeah, so I think we had a really good discussion on that as we're talking about community engagement at the senior leadership level and having those discussions in administration. And some of the advisory committees do feel, I think they're just a rubber stamp that, yep, we had this presentation and we approved the plan. And so how do we get, I saw a really engaged room here the night we had the advisory committees, all of them here, and they met with each of their board members and they were providing input and giving some thoughtful input and feeling like what they were saying was helping impact the strategies. And I actually think it did help impact a couple of them moving forward and wade into some of those. So do we use all of our advisory boards that way? I think, Jake with the library board as its transition has struggled to, how are we using them to give input versus they're just seeing a plan and moving it forward? Patty's talked about the change in the Parks Commission, the Planning Commission, the Parks Commission, when we went to Three Rivers, it kind of changed their role a little bit. The Planning Commission obviously has some specific things they have to do, but some of the other ones, community corrections, I sat on that board for several years, and I remember a couple of the folks saying, well, all we do is get a presentation and talk to. When do we get to provide some input and talk? Those types of things. I don't know the mental health or the resource council. The WMO, I think, actively gives some input to Paul on projects, and they talk about that. But are there some ways to make sure that we are engaging them and we're providing meetings that really meet their need and the ability to give some input into the process? And are there ways that we can improve as staff in how we develop those meetings and bring those forward?
Can you talk about how how we evaluate things that may not have good data. So things that provide some, or we feel provide some value, like Future Leaders Day. How do we evaluate that up against something that has really good data and determine what's valuable as an organization and how we prioritize?
I think that's always the challenge. I think one, we look at how do we get good data, or how do we get some data, because there's always data you can get, whether it's a survey or tracking someone's movement through life. It's just a matter of how much effort has to go into putting that data in. I think that's where we use the data to get to a certain point, and then we have to use the narrative and the subjective discussions to figure out where we want to go next. Do we believe this is tying into our priorities? Do we think that there's a spot 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, that we can look at data and say, was this a valuable effort, and is it something we should continue or stop? But that's where you kind of have the data ends at some point. It has to be, what is really the impact going to be on this? I think if you look at some of our areas in the county, we have really good data on how successful we are at doing certain things. But at some point, the discussion has to be, we are 15% over what our target is. Are we spending too many resources in that area versus trying to do things in another area? If we're meeting our target and this is where we want to be on it already, why are we continuing to go higher? Is there a narrative to say this is the reason? Or is it, no, we need to look at how those resources can be better deployed to meet an objective we want to have? That kind of answers your questions and kind of skirts it, but.
You know, Scott, I think there are some things we do that aren't just because of the data, but they're the exposure to the county. It gets to the communication and what does county government do, right? I mean, if I go back and I think about my high school history, I sure know what the federal government did, kind of, right, and the state government, and I knew what my city did, but I never remember being exposed to what a county did. And so talking to kids when they're younger about what we do, they're our future workforce as well. And in this economy, some of these kids maybe that have gone through in the last few years, future leaders that are now starting to graduate, we're not producing enough employees for the job openings we have. I think there's some just intrinsic things that are a benefit. I think we need to have more meetings just with the public, and I don't know how we do it. We've had a real expensive cost model through a program. We've had some really cheap models where we hold an open house, but just spending time talking with the public and learning about some of their experiences and spending time doing that. I don't know that right away you're going to get a data point out of it, but just the discussions and the exposure when we talk about the value of the county and some of the things that we're looking at moving the dial on, I think those things would pay dividends in the end. But I don't know that you're going to measure the impact of future leaders right off the bat like that. I don't know that you could.
That was a really good question, though.
Well, I guess the direction the question came from is there's things we do, we focus on being efficient, we focus on being transparent, we focus on being creative and innovative. Those are things that are spread across this organization. We see it every day. But there's things that we do that I think provide value, but how do we capture that? How do we capture, we spend a lot of money on Future Leaders Day, if you look at the staff time that's put into that day. How do we keep valuing things that we may think is valuable, but we don't necessarily have a data point that says this is our turnaround or this is our investment return? And then I'll ask a follow-up question to that as well. So one of the cities we happen to be sitting in right now does things that from a dollar standpoint may not make a whole lot of sense, like sending fire trucks out to do a splash pad. Everybody loves it. The community loves it. It brings people together. How do we look at things like that from just a dollars perspective, this may not be a good use of dollars, but it's something that builds community spirit, brings people together, and really helps people embrace the community that are in. How do we value those? I mean, in essence, we're talking about marketing. How do we measure that, or what do we do as a county along those lines to determine what's an appropriate expense?
So I think we do measure that. It's through our citizen survey and different parts of it there. It's hard to understand the cost of each percentage move for those sorts of things. But as we look at those, it really does need to be a concerted effort and conversation about what are we trying to achieve with those things? And what is the value we want to have out of it? Are we expecting people to rate our services better? Are they expecting residents to say we want to have our employees be rated even higher for quality of service? I think we have to be deliberate in what do we want to see out of those things. It is just engagement, it is marketing, but it's also that comfortability, law enforcement, comfortability with law enforcement, and certain portions of the population are very critical that they're willing to have those conversations. So those engagement efforts will have a payoff. It's just how do we measure that? Is it through the citizen survey? Do we get into specific questions, or is it more anecdotal of, no, we're starting to get calls out of this neighborhood about letting us know what's going on and we never used to hear those before. And then do we start going, okay, if we've had this shift, how do we start tracking this? Is there a way to look at, we're getting more touch points, we're getting more 911 calls from this area, even though the population hasn't grown and we haven't seen crime really increase, it's just we're having better communication on it. But good data is something that we have to work at.
And I think there are things we do, right? So when we look at this, we ask them, do they feel safe within their neighborhood? Do they feel they have access to the things that traditional communities have? So things like the fair, the historical society, those are things we've traditionally funded that help make a community. And so I think, some of those things fit into that as well. I mean, a county fair, and it attracts tens of thousands of people. I forget the exact number. The historical society, where quite a few of the elementary schools go through and learn the history of it. And so there are some benefits to just those community things that we contribute to as well that help, I think, build that sense of community that people like. It's harder to put a value on. It's much softer.
Thank you.
I'm curious, as you prepared for this discussion, what stood out to you as areas we want to focus on in the coming year and beyond?
We don't have good data on how we're communicating our service priority and budget decisions. I think we have a lot of data in here in what our financial decisions impact is compared to other communities and how much it impacts the residents in terms of their pocketbook. But we really don't have a lot of good data on how do we show that we've been communicating the priorities and the budget decision. And that's, I think, an area we want to focus on.
Yep, I'd like to drive that informing and the value of the programs and what they're seeing for it up at least 7% in that next survey.
I would say a different perspective on or just a different sort of side on the informing piece is, I think there are lots of people in our communities that, outside of government, that know things that we should know to help get the job done, that we probably don't know or don't listen to very attentively. So it's not just us getting our message out there. I think it's us being accessible, whether that's at our public service windows or whether that's getting out into the community, as Leslie said, what's the appropriate way to get out in the community. There are lots of established groups that we could try to plug into, like our chambers and Rotaries and Optimists and commercial clubs, Shakopee Diversity Alliance. I think we could do a little bit more of that and get out and just listen to what's going on. I think that's also part of informing. I think that's one thing that would make those numbers tick up as well. We know a lot, but other people, non-government people, know plenty too.
Yes, they do. Steve, did you have anything you wanted to add to that, or?
I would echo what Danny's saying, that we really need to be more transparent in our decision-making, providing the information. The budget book is a real high priority, both internally and externally, so that our employees themselves really know what went into the decision-making, and then, yes, the public too, so.
Thank you. All right, let's open it to audience questions.
I have a question. So if we want to be more transparent, would you be open to something like, here are the department requests that came in that would drive the budget up, and put it out to the public and say, I mean, it's always been pretty internal until the end, and say, give us feedback. Talk to your commissioners, talk to us, give them a place they can provide feedback back. At what process do you think that feedback should begin? At what point in the process?
So I think that's something I've done before, especially during the recession where we were in the budget cutting mode, where we actually put a survey out to say, what areas would you cut in order to keep our tax rate flat, and had an impact of what that would be to the departments. But it is a long process to work through, especially if it's some sort of survey format. I think it'd be difficult with our timing based on when we start the process. If I had to say when we do it, we'd be doing it right now and through August, and we'd actually push the conversations with the board back some, which gets us pretty tight for approving that preliminary levy based on when a lot of our departments find out what their funding levels are gonna be from the state, because we're already running up against that with how we've moved the process forward. I don't think we could move it forward very much. Those processes are good. Those processes are transparent. I think we'd have to be very deliberate in deciding what we want to put the questions out for. So there are some things that you don't want to ask if you don't want to know on, and then do it anyway. So if it's a mandated cost that we have to do, whether we want to or not, until the state changes what they dictate, we don't want to say, do you want us to pay for this or not? Because if they say no and then we still do it, well, then we're going to be in trouble with the residents for asking and then not listening. But there are still a lot of areas where we could say, this would be the impact of this request. Would you be supportive of increasing your tax levy for it? In the citizen survey, we did see that even a decent percentage of the population wouldn't be supportive of a tax increase just to maintain services, though. But I think when it's nebulous and they don't have a specific area, it's harder for them to make that judgment.
So I think it would have to be specific. You'd have to say exactly what the departments were requesting, and not just maintain service.
So Claire, my research on that, the league actually had a thing not too long ago on that for some of the cities. One, it takes an incredible amount of staff time, so you have to have the capacity to be able to do that and to work and to respond and put it together. And two, other communities have found that you have to be really clear on what the request is and the outcome. So we can say safety, public safety, and that's our number one priority. But do we understand sometimes that those impacts to have another officer or somebody out might end up with a few more speeding tickets, or might end up with something that isn't a high priority for safety? So is it something that's truly helping them feel safe in their home and their residences, or is it something that might drive up impacts and costs in other places that doesn't really drive some of those safety numbers? So educating is what what I observed on some of that is very important, that they understand what those decisions are and what the impacts are. And so it takes time to develop that, put it together so that people truly understand what the requests are and what the outcomes are that it is driving in the different areas. And so the communities that have done that have had like several staff dedicated to some of that work. So having the capacity and being able to do that would be the other thing we'd have to really think through on some of those areas. We've tried to get at it, I think, like Danny said, through the citizen survey in some ways. Where are your priorities, those types of things, and consistently transportation, public safety, and taking care of our most vulnerable. In the, 4 surveys I've been involved, those 3 have consistently been in their top areas of where we should invest. And I think when they take a look at the results surveys, those consistently were the highest ones as well, and where they thought the county should be focused.
So capacity issues are real, but to me, when you ask that question, I got it, because I think that would be intriguing to know. And to Danny's point, we might be asking for input that it turns out we didn't want in the first place. If folks said we don't ever want library increases, that would be disappointing to me, but it might be helpful to know. And I think it would be really intriguing to get that information out, and that's what we need to be doing. That's what we're driving toward anyway, that clarity of this is specifically what the request is for, this is what it's trying to achieve, and this is how we're going to measure it. I think when we have some more confidence internally that we are hitting those marks with our requests, I think it'd be worth a good conversation about turning that over to the public and getting their input directly.
I think we're a little shy of having, that my concern would be, Claire, is I'm not against it. That's what I've actually researched it. But when I've looked at those things and tried to figure it out, we have, I think, a few steps to go to be able to clearly get the information out there in the right format and put it so people understand it.
In a previous life, I was hired by the Northeast Ohio Sewer District to work on some projects with them, and they had a previous project where, kind of what Dan was saying, they gave the answer that they thought it should be, but then asked the public, what do you want? And the public saw right through that, and it created a lot of heartburn and mistrust that, why are you asking for our advice if you already know the answer? So, somewhat of caution on that. And then just to tie that in, a question about the advisory committees. You can have within capacity building and working with communities, formal networks and informal networks. And our advisory committees are part of that formal network, and they can carry some of that story and some of that transparency to their constituents, to their people too, if they feel that their advice is valued. If they don't, then it just breeds more mistrust. And so my question somewhat is, our advisory committees right now, who are they advising? Are they advising me to take that up through the process? Are they advising the new budget team, or are they advising the board?
We can kind of say all of the above. I think primarily they work through staff right now, but also they are appointees of the board, and so there should be a feeling of having conversations with the board members on, if this request going forward, this is why it's valuable to me. And I've been in places where the advisory committees show up to the budget discussions, and while it's still staff making the presentation, an advisory board chair may be sitting up at the table and justifying a request to the board and advising them and advocating for the area that they are working on. And I think we've seen that in some areas, especially where there a recent conversation with the Parks Advisory Council, where they advocated for certain things to the board.
Paul, I think that's a really good question. And having talked to 3 of the advisory committee kind of leaders at the staff level, I'm not so sure after that meeting that there was clarity even in all of their eyesight of who they're advising and why they're doing it, because things have changed and evolved with time. As the library changed, became under the county, as Three Rivers came into play, and there's another level of approvals. And so as those have changed, I don't know that they could necessarily even answer those questions. It was a very interesting discussion. And I think that's one of the things, is defining that. You know, I'd ask Molly the role of the Community Corrections Board, and who are they advising? Is it the Community Corrections Department? Is it the county board? There's, you know, those are things that I think were actually unclear to a couple of the leaders. And I think we could do a better job there, even on how we're making appointments and who we're appointing, you know, those types of things. We've had several vacancies for a while. How do we make sure that people want to be there and that we're listening? So I think it's an area we could improve in.
Other audience questions? Thanks, Paul. All right, Madam Chair, can we give it back to you for board questions?
Thank you very much. Questions, comments from the board? Commissioner Alders.
I wrote down some things here. You've talked about many of them already, but the title for this section was Communicating Service Priorities, Budget Decisions, and the Value of Taxes Paid. I'm wondering, when you get a score of 60, 70% on something, how much information are you getting on the negative side of that, the 30% that gave a less than favorable view? For example, on the citizen survey, if you say, how well do you think we're communicating with you? And if they give an unfavorable score, do we ask, well, how would you like us to communicate? What are your ways that you receive information? And I think we need to think about communication much more deeply than we are. When I first ran for office, a local newspaper had a circulation of about 9,000 or 9,500. When I ran for office relatively recently, it was about half of that. People are getting information in different ways, and I think it's critical that we analyze that and respond and I don't know if we've got enough horsepower in our communication department, to tell you the truth. Things that we don't communicate even in this report is how well do people know that about 80% of what we do is mandated, it's required. So when they maybe have fault with how we're spending in certain categories, how well do we communicate? Well, that's the job that we have been given by the legislature to do these services. I've had on a different topic, I've had a running debate with Gary Shelton ever since Scale began that, boy, if we keep giving away these services free to our jurisdictions, our cities, townships, and wherever, we have to stand for re-election on the levy, you know. And you mentioned a few of them, Leslie, that we give away. And the fiber optic ring, we spent several $1 million there. We didn't charge anybody for it to connect, and some jurisdictions wanted to charge us for it to run to their buildings to connect them to the ring, which was crazy. And the training center, we carry a much larger share than you would think that we should. We pay for each jurisdiction's membership in greater MSP. We've donated oodles of time, probably 2 or 3 staff positions worth of time a year to Scale since its inception. So we give a lot away. And I'm in favor of that. I'm not wanting to charge the cities, but we ought to at least have that recorded in a way that, I mean, I think our numbers would be way to the left, more like Anoka's or Washington counties, in that instead of the 7.75 or whatever it was, to 59 one chart. So I think, but communication to me seems to be the key here is how well are we receiving and giving information, and I think we need to think more deeply about that. That's probably a comment rather than a question, but.
It's a good comment.
Anything else? Any reactions to Commissioner Alert's comment?
We do ask, I believe, in the commissioner, how folks are using what we provide today and how they would prefer to get information. So I know Lisa we are taking a look at that as we look at some community engagement alternatives at the administration team. But fiber is a big one. When you brought that one up, I missed that in my discussion. Yeah, that was a big investment.
And we do get individual comments in the survey, but I don't think, at least I haven't gone through and looked at those on these specific questions to say what are the comments related to this that we're hearing on them. So.
Commissioner Beard.
Thank you, Madam Chair. On page 6, the quartiles. I don't know if it's because I've got a mental block to what's going on here or what, but I think of quartiles as quarters of the year, and maybe that's not what's happening. I know we touched on it right in the very beginning, an hour or something ago, but could someone go over this again and explain this to me? Operating budgets by quartiles, who determines what's in a quartile? And because I heard at one point, I think Jake talked about the things that we have to do, the core necessary functions of government, like jail, courts, things like that, that we have to do. And they're way over here in quartile 4, which is a very small number. And I think I'm thinking of it exactly backwards from that, but illuminate me, if you would, please.
So are you gonna?
Sure. So how this gets determined for the quartiles is we first go through and we create a program inventory. We go through and determine what are the programs that Scott County truly performs. Then we go through and score the programs against our result maps.
Give me one example, Steve, would you please?
So treatment court would be a program.
Okay.
So then the program manager of the treatment court goes through and scores their program at impacting each one of the result maps, safe, healthy, and livable. So that provides the initial score of the program. Then we have an independent committee that reviews the scores so that all the scores are similar across the organization. So we have a committee that looks at safety scores, or safe scores, healthy scores, livable scores. Then there's more of a consistency in all the scoring. After we do all the scoring, we have a third-party outside vendor called the Centers of Priority-Based Budgeting that takes all our scores, and they've had a program that they've worked with other communities on. They see how do the scores compare in total, and then they have the basis to determine what programs should go in quartiles 1, 2, 3, and 4 for how impactful they are at meeting the overall results. So it really is an outside party that has determined that for us, but we do all of the work internally for the scoring itself.
So the results map for SAFE, Commissioner, are like, people can travel about safely, they feel safe in their home. It's these ovals that we've talked about over the years.
Those, yes,
So
okay.
it's how effective a program is at preventing criminal behavior. Citizens can travel and move about safely. They feel safe, they know their neighbors, children, and they feel good in the community. Children and vulnerable adults are protected and their basic needs are met. We have clean soil, water, and air, and we enforce laws and we respond to emergency situations. That's the SAFE map. So how well a program does at supporting safety, healthy, and livable, they get that score. And the ones that do that the best are the quartile 1 programs. And so those are quite often also mandated programs. They might, my point was, as Pam had said, they weren't mandated. The quartile 4 is actually a lot of mandated programs. They're core things, but if you were to go to a results map, you're not going to see the public talking about our land is recorded right. The assessor comes to my house. So when we talked to them, when we went out, Claire, Lisa, folks, to develop these, Judith, those were not the type of things that came up as a high priority to our residents. It was our roads are plowed, our water's clean, our law enforcement responds. If you go to healthy, it's that the elderly can live at home, the types of services that we provide out of the county to make that happen, that the schools are good, not even ours, but schools were a high priority in the livable category to our residents. And then those are scored how well they do. And so broken out then by how much we invest, levy and non-levy, into those programs.
Boy, I'd like to say you cleared that up for me, but perhaps we'll come back at it from another perspective, because again, I'm looking at it as quartile means something to me on a calendar basis. This has nothing to do with the calendar.
No, nothing.
Well, what I did hear was a couple comments that warmed my heart. Jake's comments about this performance-based budgeting being able to, enabling supervisors to get back to their team and say, and recognizing that the team sees that they're part of a larger organization and be okay that they didn't get a 8% funding increase because we needed to do it somewhere else in order to live within the overall picture. That your ability to have 730 employees all own the entire thing is pretty impressive, and I just wanted to applaud you for that. A suggestion, we talk about necessary functions, core functions of government, like the ones over in quartile 4. To my way of thinking, those should be ranked a lot higher, because the most fundamental thing we do is we start with land ownership and keeping that straight. If we don't have an address we can protect, we don't even have an organized society. Honest, fair elections with integrity, voting is hugely important to our way of life. These are things that maybe we don't give the public enough credit for recognizing, or maybe they do and we don't recognize the credit that they give to foundational things that I think are nonpartisan and we all agree on. We can quibble over the width of a trail and whether that's an mobility issue or a parks issue and things like that. Those are policy things, but I have a hunch that the trail thing scores more in quartile 1 than good elections score in quartile 4, and it's just one that I'm puzzling over. And I'll probably catch up with you at some day, so be okay.
And Commissioner, that's why I raised that, and probably Jen is the best one of anybody on our staff when we have a PBB discussion of saying, this is a model, it puts things in quartiles, but you still have to have the discussion on the specifics of the program as you're evaluating it. And so because of what you're talking about, elections doesn't score high and safe, it doesn't score high and healthy, but it is something we have to do and we have to do well.
Yes.
And you will see that elections is one of your community indicators. And Cindy does do a very good job of reporting back some efficiency indicators and how we do in our accuracy. So it's still measured, it's still looked at, as importantly as a project in quartile 1. That's why I'm saying some of them in quartile 4 are exactly what Pam said. It might be something we're opting to do, Future Leaders Day, fish, something like that potentially. But a lot of them in quartile 4 are mandated things that we have to do that are core services of a county going back 150 years.
I could continue that discussion, but let me just say thank you for the presentation. We'll take it up again.
Great. Commissioner Beer.
I love that we're even talking about this, because we don't dictate or mandate what gets discussed here. We could, but we haven't had to. And the fact that we're even talking about this and bringing this out into light beyond our budget workshops and things like that are huge. And I also love on page 2, it's the what's not working well and why area. Like, this just feels to me super candid, super heartfelt, and super transparent of like, hey, we want to communicate and do things well, and we're not going to bury this. We're not going to not have this at a Scott County delivered. We want to talk about this. And I think, you know, I'll use Jake's phrase is, you know, it is this weird paradox of, in that tension that exists between, hey, go out and transform lives, do a great job, but try to do it for like 90 cents instead of $1. I mean, that tension exists, and it probably isn't going to go away. And I think we're very open and honest about that, top to bottom. You know, ideas, the things that we do, Commissioner Ulrich mentioned some of the things like scale. Like, is the concept, I believe that wholeheartedly as well. Turn in the corner a little bit here. But it also works best when everybody buys in, you know, because we from the taxpayers win when it works well. And, you know, because we're in this tension and this paradox, and it goes for any other program really, everything needs to be on the table always. We need to always be willing to have a discussion about whatever it is. Because there's an expression that sacred cows make excellent hamburgers. And so we need to be willing, right, to look at everything. Which I'm kind of hungry right now too, so that may have had something to do with it. And I think we're getting to a spot, and maybe we have been, but it just feels like we're getting to a spot where, hey, everything's on the table. We want the best. We feel the weight of being in government and being responsible for lives and people's dollars, and it just feels to me like, and maybe it has been, so I'm not saying that it hasn't been, but it just really feels like the lid's been pulled off. And everyone has an opportunity to look in and view in and have discussion points, you know, whether we send it out to the community or not, but I love the idea that we are all in this thing together, and that we are all willing to talk about this and have the hard discussions, and let's see where the chips fall. And to me, that does my heart well. I think it does our citizens well by knowing that we take this stuff seriously, and it's not just want, or some marketing, let's talk about it and never talk about it again. We do talk about it. And ABC, always be communicating, right? Took the G off there, you know, always be communicating. You know, how do we tell this story? And how do we keep it fresh? We tend to know it, but our citizens don't. So how are we always telling the story? We need to be our best storytellers. If we're not, how do we expect anyone else to? We need to be telling the stories, and we need to be correcting the stories. And we need to tell it like it's the first time we told it, because we're always changing, and certainly our county is always changing. So how do we do that? It's a tall order, but I think we're on a track of doing that better than we ever have. I've heard expressions like, hey, it feels like a breath of fresh air, there's a pep in the step, and that's from employees, from jurisdictions we work in, and constituents, and that's awesome. It's progress, not perfection. And we're on the journey together. So thank you for taking the time to talk about this, and I know it's not just talk. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
I would just make a couple quick short comments. You know, I look at all the graphs and think I could break them all down, but on page 5 there was the one about saying citizens ratings of values for taxes paid. I think there's 40% of the people out there that are going to vote there's no value for, that's just the way, am I right? You know, that's the county and the atmosphere we live in here, so it's, I think full saturation, if we got 60, that'd be a pretty good number. But anyhow, I agree with what Jake said. It boils down to us here, the five of us. You know, what direction we give, and if people don't like what we're doing, we'll find out in November of the year we're up. You know, so that's how it works. So that's my comments. Thank you.
Right.
Can I make one more?
Yes.
I think we'd be remiss if we didn't highlight one of these slides, 87% score for excellent or good for our Scott County employees. That's really something to celebrate and to say way to go, and thanks for the good work of our employees. That's one of the highest scores in the survey, so thank you.
Good point. Thank you. Thank you for the comments. Thank you to the panel, the panelists. A very good discussion. I am just heartened how we're starting to use these discussions even more to talk about, well, here's where we're at, here's some good stuff, but here's where we're going. And I really see that direction changing. I'm very happy about that. I think that's just a good use of everybody's time. Here's where we're going, here's how we want to improve, here's what's not working well, or what new things we're gonna do. I really appreciate the talk about communication and the changes in communication. Yep, Commissioner Ulrich's very right. I don't think communication is just more newspaper articles or Facebook posts. It's really what you're talking about. It's about all of us being in the community. It's about our employees when they're on the front lines being able to tell the story, or when they're on the road right away working on weed management. That's been the subject of a lot of calls lately. That's where we're going to do that better communication and get our citizens more fully engaged here. So thank you, everybody. A great presentation. We're going to take a 5-minute recess to reconfigure the room.